Good morning, everyone. Welcome you all to this public lecture on why put social work in libraries by Professor Beth Wahler. We begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay our respects to the elders, past and present. We extend that respect to our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I hand it over to Professor Beth Wahler. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk with all of you today about social work in the library. Let me share my screen here. Okay, so I'm going to start out by telling you a little bit about me and my work and how I came to this work of partnering with libraries and building library and social work collaborations. So I'm currently the director of the School of Social Work at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte on the East Coast of the United States. And I sort of fell into library and social work collaborations by accident about 8 years ago. And I, at that time, was in a different state. I was in an administrative position in a different school of social work. And our local public library approached our school and asked for social work students. And this was at a time, so again, it was about 8 years ago. We did have library social work in the US. We've had library social work for almost 15 years now. But it still at that time was pretty infrequent and was really only in very large urban areas for the most part. So I didn't know a lot about library social work. I honestly didn't even know at that time a lot about the needs that public libraries have and how social work could help with those things. So the library started telling us about what they were experiencing, and especially at their downtown branch or their main library, they were having challenges with patrons who were chronically unhoused and were coming to the library every day. They were having challenges with people who had mental health problems, people who had substance use disorders and were sometimes overdosing in the library bathrooms. And the needs that the library visitors had were really exceeding the training of staff, and they were hoping to have social work students in their library. My background as a social worker, I had been a social worker for about 14 years before I got my PhD and became an academic. And in my practice as a social worker, I had worked primarily with people who were experiencing homelessness, people who were experiencing substance use disorders, and people who had mental health problems. And I actually had been, motivated to go back and get my PhD because I got really frustrated and felt like the interventions that we had really were not sufficient for people who lacked resources and who were experiencing homelessness or serious poverty and living in serious poverty. And so that's actually what drove me back to get my PhD, was to try to develop better interventions for some populations that were really falling through the cracks. So when the library started talking about what they were experiencing, it was a natural overlap with my own experience as a social worker and my own interests. So I actually offered to do a needs assessment with that library first, because I wanted to be clear about what we were going to be asking students to do during their internship. And I wanted to be clear about what kind of supervision we were going to need to provide for the students. So I worked with that library, did a needs assessment where we talked with patrons and we talked with staff. We did pilot social work practicum students in that library. We continued gathering data that then that library was able to use to justify hiring a full-time social worker. So with that work, we started publishing and presenting on what was happening there, and libraries started coming from all across the United States asking for similar help. So over the last 8 years, I've done a lot of different needs assessments with large urban libraries, with small rural ones, everything in between, and sometimes even large state library associations are looking at the needs of an entire state in the US. I then started a consulting business about a year and a half ago called Beth Wahler Consulting. where I work with libraries doing needs assessments. I also do a lot of training about de-escalation and managing patron challenges from a trauma-informed lens. And then I also develop different kinds of social work collaborations or similar collaborations for libraries around the United States. So at this point, I've worked with a number of new library social workers, new library social work programs, and also social work students. So that's a little bit about my work and how I came to this work. I have a book that's actually coming out later this year. It's available for pre-order now, but it's called Creating a Person-Centered Library, Best Practices for Supporting High Needs Patrons. And it's co-authored with Sarah Johnson, who's a librarian and a social worker in the US who primarily works with libraries that are adding social work interns in their libraries. So that book is coming and talks a lot about different kinds of collaborations and services that libraries can do to address high needs patrons, including social work collaborations. And it also talks about different strategies libraries can use to support their staff. So today in this seminar, I'm going to talk a little bit about the changing needs of public library visitors and staff. I'm going to talk about how social work can complement these library services to address these kinds of needs that are happening. I'm going to provide some information about current social work and library collaborations and what their focus is and how they came to be, and even some of the ways that they've funded these programs, primarily in the US. And I'm going to talk about what libraries can do and what social workers can do if you want to try to develop a new collaboration in your local area. I know that in the audience today, we have people from the library side. We also have social workers. So there will be times during this presentation that I'm talking specifically to one of those groups or another. In my work, I often find that people on the social work side don't really understand contemporary librarianship and what it looks like. And people on the library side often don't understand social work and the full scope of services that social workers can offer. So part of the goal for this presentation is to make sure that both sides understand a little bit better about what is impacting the other. So let's start by talking about how libraries have changed over the past, really the past decade, the past couple of decades, and how that's impacting library staff right now, and how this is really setting the stage for social work to support and help. So I did a quick image search of librarian and library, and this is what came up. There were lots of pictures of people with books. Almost every picture has people in it that are holding books. There also were multiple pictures of people shushing people in the library or asking them to be quiet. There were multiple images of people who were reading to children, or clearly having some sort of conversation with children, and this is what came up over and over and over again. And this is often what people think a library is if they haven't really been actively involved with their local public library. So oftentimes people think of libraries as places where people get books and other media. They think of libraries as very quiet spaces where you're not allowed to talk and you have to sit quietly and read your book. And people often think that library staff, some of whom are librarians and some who are other, have other roles in the library, but people often think that library staff are people who are sitting around reading books quietly, just asking people to be quiet. But this is not accurate. And if you have not been to your local public library recently, I encourage you to go, because libraries right now are active community centers. They often have lots of other services like providing employment assistance. Many of them now contain maker spaces where there are lots of different things for people to be creative. So some libraries have spaces where there are 3D printers to use, there are laser etching machines, there are sewing machines where people can actually come and sometimes participate in a class or learn a new skill. And many times people are coming to libraries to use these spaces to start businesses even. Many libraries have gaming rooms where people play video games. They may have recording studios where people are developing podcasts or some sort of webinar or video that they're making. Many libraries have different kinds of programs that are designed to combat social isolation, help people learn a variety of new skills, or give space for people to gather around shared interests. We have lots of public libraries that provide immigration support, such as citizenship programs, language classes, and conversation clubs, so people who are learning the local language can practice speaking it with other people. Libraries often house active children's play areas, and many have teen gathering spaces now. Libraries often have support groups or other supportive services for health and well-being. We've seen an increase in libraries that offer exercise programs or yoga classes or things like that in the space. Many libraries now have services to support health literacy and to promote health. So some libraries are actually offering health screenings or connection with local medical providers or blood pressure screenings or things like that. We see libraries that have meeting spaces and gathering spaces for people to use from all kinds of community groups. And many libraries are teaching computer literacy skills and offering computer and internet access to people who may otherwise not have it. So many libraries are offering some of these services or all of these services, and some are even offering things that I don't have listed here. But libraries are no longer, in most cases, these quiet spaces where people are just reading books. And instead, they really are these active community centers in many different cities and municipalities around the world. These growing services, so as libraries have really added a lot of services to meet the needs of their communities, this is coming at a time when they are also facing unprecedented challenges. So many libraries have seen significant funding cuts over the last decade or last few years. We've seen rising numbers of challenges to intellectual freedom with people who are either protesting or in some cases actually threatening harm to libraries or library staff because they're opposed to something that's in that library's collection or some sort of program that's happening. These kinds of threats and challenges are rising rapidly in the US where I'm from. We also see that many times people really misunderstand library services and question the relevance of libraries. I can't tell you how many times I have done an interview with somebody in the media about my work, and one of the questions they ask is, "Are public libraries even relevant anymore now that we have information at our fingertips and we can access the internet, on our phone, and many of us at home?" I get asked, "Are libraries even relevant?" And yes, they are highly relevant and they are highly needed, but there's a real misunderstanding about library services. We've also seen across the globe an increase in behavioral challenges and in general incivility that's happening. And this has rapidly increased just since the COVID pandemic, with people who are stressed in general and more irritable than ever. And these behavioral challenges have been increasing for the past few years as well. So this is a time when libraries have really shifted the services they're providing to remain relevant and meet the needs of their community. And they're also facing a huge number of challenges. We also have seen, and this is a piece that's highly relevant to us as social workers, we've seen an increase in the psychosocial needs of library visitors across the world. And by psychosocial needs, I mean any kind of psychological, social, or environmental factor that's associated with chronic stress and strain in general populations. So these are things like poverty-related needs and housing instability, mental health challenges, social isolation, substance use disorders. So we've seen increases in the number of public library visitors who have these kinds of psychosocial needs, because these needs in general are growing in many of our communities around the world. And we are also seeing a reduction in the social safety net that's there to try to support people with these needs. So that's impacting who walks in the library's doors and what kind of services they need. My own research for years focused on needs assessments and looking at patron needs and staff needs in libraries. And what I've seen and what others that are studying that area have seen consistently is that the top areas of need of public library visitors are homelessness or unsafe or unstable housing, mental health challenges, substance use and overdose. In the US in particular, we're seeing a huge increase in overdoses that are happening in public libraries. And then we've seen an increase in poverty related needs in public library visitor populations. And just like I said, that instability and behavioral challenges have been increasing since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we've also seen an increase in these other kinds of psychosocial needs that have been increasing since the beginning of the pandemic. And we're not expecting to see a reduction in these needs anytime soon. And although the frequency of needs varies, we're seeing similar needs in public library visitor populations in both urban and rural libraries. So there's been a growing body of research and a growing number of media articles that are focused on urban libraries, but in my own needs assessments with rural libraries, I'm seeing the exact same thing, that the frequency of these needs may vary, and it may be lower in rural libraries because rural libraries generally serve a lower number of people altogether. But these same kinds of patron needs are present, and they're causing a great deal of stress and strain for many library staff. So in general, library staff are really feeling the strain. First of all, we were talking about shifts that have happened in their jobs in many cases and in the kinds of services that they're offering in their libraries. But on top of that, they're having these increased needs that they're seeing in their visitor population. Staff in libraries are often not trained or qualified to assist with these really complex needs. So when we're talking about somebody with a substance use disorder who may be under the influence when they're in the library or may have overdosed, if we're talking about people that are having a mental health crisis in the library, all of these kinds of needs are not things that most library staff are generally trained to work with. Staff sometimes feel conflicted about what their role is even supposed to be with these needs. And that shows up repeatedly in the needs assessments I've done, where staff in any given library have various opinions about what their role is supposed to be. And in many cases, they feel like they've become social workers, or they feel like they're expected to be social workers, but that's not what they chose for their profession. And it's not what they want to do. We also see that library staff are experiencing greater strain because visitors who have these kinds of needs often take more of their time, which stretches them, very thin and can cause trouble with them trying to meet all of the needs of their various visitors and patron populations. So, people with these complex needs may eat up a lot of time, which causes a lot of stress then for library staff who are really trying to address everybody's needs in their library. We also are seeing an increase in violence that's happening in libraries, and some staff are describing being fearful for their safety or fearful for the safety of other people using the library because of some of these patron needs and visitor challenges that are happening. And some libraries have had to add security or have to frequently call the police or for emergency assistance because of things that are actually happening in their library space every day. So this is causing a great deal of stress and strain for many library workers everywhere. We also have a growing body of research that's looking at the experience of workplace trauma for library staff. So in the US, frontline or public-facing library workers from all types of libraries in urban, suburban, and rural communities are reporting high rates of workplace violence and high rates of resulting trauma. And in my own needs assessments, over half of the staff that I've worked with have actually experienced violence in their job. And sometimes they've been the target of that violence, and sometimes they've witnessed violence where someone else has been the target. The incidents that library staff are describing that are happening in their workplace are that they're experiencing verbal abuse. This is becoming more and more common. They are often experiencing physical aggression and actually being assaulted or attacked by people in the library. We're seeing increases in threats of violence, in sexual harassment that's happening, being threatened with weapons, and having people come in and destroy library property. So this is becoming more and more frequent and is actually causing trauma for the staff that are working with people who are displaying these behaviors. These kinds of incidents, as I've mentioned, have increased since the COVID pandemic began, and they're continuing to worsen in the current political climate, especially in the US. And some library staff actually report experiencing symptoms of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or other kinds of trauma responses, or experiencing symptoms of a mental health problem for the first time or worsening of a pre-existing mental health condition. In my own needs assessments, I'm going to show you some data from some of my own work. So what I'm going to show you first are the results of several needs assessments with library staff. The staff who participated in these needs assessments represent 7 different libraries in 4 different states in the US. 3 were in the Midwestern US and 1 was in the East. 3 are from really large metropolitan areas, very large urban areas. 2 are from much smaller, kind of small towns, and then 2 are from rural libraries. These needs assessments were done through electronic surveys that were sent to all staff in these libraries. The surveys and the needs assessments overall asked about their perceptions of unmet patron needs, their perceptions of the library's responsibility and role with these kinds of needs, and then their interest in specific training topics. What I'm going to show you, though, today is just the results where they talked about the biggest unmet needs of their visitor populations. So if you look at this table, the ones that are in blue they made it to the top 5 reported unmet needs of library visitors for these particular libraries. And there's one, I think it's the second column from the left, actually has 6 because there was a tie, so there are 6 highlighted. But for all 7 of these libraries, financial needs and mental health were in the top 5 areas of unmet patron needs or visitor needs. For 6 out of 7, housing made it to the top. For another 6 out of 7, substance abuse was at the top. And then for another 6 out of 7, employment was at the top. And then you can see there's a little bit of variation with one of the bigger, more urban libraries on the left reporting that medical and physical health needs were in the top 5 unmet patron needs. The second one from the left had social connections that were an unmet need in that particular community. And then the one that's the second from the right had also had medical and physical health as one of their top 5 needs. So these are the kinds of needs that staff are reporting that again are causing a great deal of stress and strain because they are often not trained to intervene or help people with these kinds of challenges. I've also done a number of needs assessment methods needs assessments with library patron or library visitor populations. I'm going to show you the results from 3 different libraries today. 2 of these are very large urban libraries. One is a much smaller suburban library, and these come from 2 different Midwestern states in the US. And if you look at these, so these are the self-reported needs from patrons. Now, in the first column on the left, that library only administered this survey by offering it in the physical library space. So people had to actually be using a library computer or using one of the library. They had to be in the library to complete the survey. The middle one and the one on the right also offered it in the physical library space, but they sent it through email to their email list for their library. So the numbers of participants, the percentage of people who reported these kinds of needs is lower because for those 2 libraries, the needs assessment survey got sent to a much broader audience and not necessarily people who were actually using the library. In fact, some of these people who participated in this needs assessment survey really never even came to the physical space, and they were just using online resources from the library. So as you can imagine, people who are using the online resources and not necessarily coming in person are people who don't need the computers. They have computer and Wi-Fi access, somewhere else in their own life, and they often have other resources. But financial needs were in the top 5 reported unmet needs for visitors from all 3 of these libraries. Also, medical and physical health and employment made it in the top 5 for all 3 of these libraries. 2 out of 3 had patrons who reported mental health as being one of their top unmet needs. 2 out of 3 reported education and literacy as being a top unmet need. The biggest urban library on the left people reported that they had difficulty with transportation. This is a city in the US where there is not a lot of public transportation. And then clothing also made it in the top 5 for that particular library. And then social connections was in the middle library as the top 5. So you can see, and what I've seen even in libraries that aren't represented here, is that we see the same needs over and over, although the percentage of people with those needs varies a great deal based on the resources that are in that particular community and how easy those resources are to access. But we typically see mental health at the top on both the perceived needs identified from the staff about their patrons and also self-reported needs of patrons as well. And we often also see financial and poverty related needs and those kinds of challenges at the top as well. So with all of this, because of the changing landscape of library work and what it looks like in a contemporary public library, as well as these challenges that are coming from our communities and structures with reductions in funding or threats to funding, and the growing numbers of library visitors that have these kinds of psychosocial needs, library staff are asking for help. Every single needs assessment I do, every single library I meet with, I hear frequently that the work has gotten more and more difficult. I talk often with staff who've worked in libraries for decades who tell me consistently that things are harder now than they've ever been, and that things seem worse now than ever as far as the kinds of challenges they have to work with. So this is where social work comes in. So there's been a growing movement that started in the US, but now has expanded to both Canada and Australia to partner social work services with public libraries to address these kinds of challenges that I'm talking about. The first full-time library social worker was hired for San Francisco Public Library in California in the US in 2009. After that one, after that position was started, we saw a few others pop up in the years after that, but they were always in very large urban areas. And I don't know how much the audience knows about San Francisco in particular, but that's really an atypical community in the US. It's a very, very large urban city with lots of people experiencing homelessness, a huge drug problem, particularly with IV drugs. It also tends to be a very progressive community where many services are offered to try to address the challenges, but this community in many ways looks very different from most of the rest of the US. And so what we saw is after this position was created, others learned about it, but didn't really see how it could fit in their library or their community. And so we really only saw these positions popping up in really large urban progressive areas. In the past few years, though, we've seen a drastic increase in the US in library social work positions or library social work programs in many different kinds of libraries. And we have now started seeing them in small rural libraries, as well as all different sizes of communities across the US. Here in Australia, the first full-time library social work position was added in the city of Melbourne libraries in 2019. So it's been here in Australia for about 4 years. There are a number of other positions that have been added, with several that have been added very, very recently. So it is starting to expand a little bit more here in Australia as well. Globally, there are about 100 full-time social work positions in public libraries and approximately 40 other kinds of library social work positions. So these are people who aren't full-time employees at a library, but they might be part-time employees or other kinds of collaborations that have added social work in different ways to libraries. And then in the US in particular, we have 160 libraries, 160 known libraries, there could be more, who have added social work interns or social work students. So we've seen an increase in the US with libraries that have social work students in them that don't have an actual professional social worker in those libraries. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in this presentation. So with these positions, there are many different models. One of the challenges with library social work is that every library is different and every community is different. And that means that every library social work program or library social work position has to be created and adapted for that particular context. So when we look at these existing library social work positions and programs, they are just as varied and different as the libraries that they're in. But there are lots of different models for adding social work in the library. And the one thing I want to clarify is that this does not mean that libraries have become social service providers. Sometimes people are curious when they hear about a social worker being in the library and they're picturing a very clinical model of social work, and they're picturing the library then sort of changing their scope or changing their mission to become a social service organization. And that's not what's happening. In all of these communities, the social worker is really there to help with information needs of people who are visiting that library. It's just a different kind of information and trying to connect people with resources in the community that they may need for these various psychosocial needs. And libraries that are adding social work are really focusing often on relationships as the new reference collection, which is a quote and a term that comes from the book Whole Person Librarianship, which I'll talk about a little bit later too. So for people on the library side, just like I find that the general public really misunderstands what library work is and what libraries look like, I also find that people in the general public misunderstand social work and don't really understand all of the things that social workers do. So I want to talk for just a minute about what social work is so that it's clear how it fits into a library context. So this particular definition or description of social work comes from the US and the National Association of Social Work document with the Code of Ethics that we have in the US. I'm going to talk in just a minute about some information that comes from here in Australia about social work. But I like this particular definition because, or this description of social work, because it says the primary mission of the social work profession is to enhance human well-being and help meet the basic human needs of all people, with particular attention to the needs and empowerment of people who are vulnerable, oppressed, and living in poverty. A historic and defining feature of social work is the profession's dual focus on individual well-being in a social context and the well-being of society. Fundamental to social work is attention to the environmental forces that create, contribute to, and address problems in living. So often people think of us as social workers as, we're here to serve individuals, and we may offer very clinically focused services where we may be doing assessments, we may be actually providing therapy, making referrals to people, but it's part of our professional mission to, yes, work with individuals, but also to recognize the environmental and social factors that impact our behavior as individuals, and to try to influence those things as well, which I'll talk about in a minute. Here in Australia, your Australian Association of Social Workers actually goes on to describe lots of different ways that social workers may support their clients or the people they work with. So this clarifies that as social workers, we work with individuals, families, groups, and communities. We work at all of those different levels. And social workers, some of us are doing one-on-one counseling and casework with individual clients. Some of us are doing group work, which includes health promotion groups or groups aimed at reducing social isolation, or building groups that are focused on shared experiences, or topics that are of interest. We also, as social workers, are trained to do community development, where we implement programs that are focused on community well-being through targeted and enhanced engagement, for example, health promotion activities or activities that are really aimed towards specific age cohorts. Social workers often do advocacy with and on behalf of people who are experiencing a variety of stresses and strains, who may be experiencing violence, or may have challenges with resources or housing or things like that. Social workers also influence policy. So we are trained to analyze policy and influence policy, to try to inform legislation that happens, or government and community services. Social workers are also trained to do research and education, where we actually use research to try to bring about change as needed, or social change, or we develop the evidence base to support certain types of interventions or to develop new interventions. So when I talked about my own experience as a social worker, and I went back to get my PhD because I wanted to know more about how to develop more effective interventions to keep people from falling through the cracks. And social workers do deliver support on a one-on-one basis or via group counseling. But this mentions at the bottom that social workers are trained to listen to people and support them to address personal difficulties and structural barriers in their lives. So again, that's that piece where we're trained to focus on the person and their environment, and to think about how we can influence all different levels to then impact somebody's overall functioning and resources. So social work is a really broad profession, but you can see from the list here some of the ways that we really fit in when you think about my earlier description of public library work and some of the things that are happening in public libraries. They really are a natural fit for many of the skills and experiences that we have professionally as social workers. Libraries make great places for a social worker to be embedded, and much of the attention in the media has been on the benefit to the library when they have a social work in the space. But in my conversations with library social workers, I find that these settings are equally as beneficial and positive for the social worker working in them. So libraries do a great job of being accessible to everybody. There's no stigma associated with visiting them. They work really hard to be these safe, comfortable, welcoming, inclusive spaces for everybody in that community. And people working in libraries are very knowledgeable about resources, what trustworthy sources of information are for different kinds of needs. But this is a really good, comfortable space for us as social workers to operate as well, and a place to reach people who are coming to libraries because it's a safe space. And these same people may not always feel the same about our actual social service organizations. Sometimes they have not felt as welcome in some of our organizations because of a number of reasons. And in addition, there's a stigma that's often associated with visiting a service for a mental health problem or a substance use problem, or because they're struggling with poverty. And there is not that same stigma associated with going to the library. Libraries are really true generalist environments. So on the social work side, we talk about generalist social work, or being trained to work with all different age groups, all different populations, all different kinds of needs and challenges. And libraries really are true generalist settings where they see a snapshot of everybody that's in that community, and they see all different age groups, all different demographics, all different kinds of people. One of the ways that we really work together well is that library professionals are often trained to identify what resources somebody needs right now and to link somebody to those resources. But on the social work side, we're trained to help people with the resources that they need right now, but we're also trained to look for some of the underlying issues or underlying needs that may contribute to that person's current circumstances. So we can help connect people with resources, but we can also assess for other things that may actually be causing or contributing to the person's current set of circumstances. Social workers are trained to work across what we call the micro to macro continuum of services. This means that we're trained to work at the micro level or the individual level, so we can assess and work with individuals. This also means we're trained to work at the meso or the group level, where we can facilitate group counseling or psychoeducational groups, or do training groups, or all different kinds of group work. And then we're also trained to work at the macro side of things, which is the community or the organizational level. So it gives us the ability to, if we're embedded in a library, to really work at all of those levels. We also are trained professionally to try to foster independence and to look for things that could create somebody's dependence on us, and to really be wary of those things and conscious, about those things, so that we are working to make sure we're fostering independence long term with somebody. We're trained to use clinical skills, even if we're not in clinical work or in casework or in a clinical casework kind of environment. So all social workers, as part of their education, are trained to work with individuals and to use different skills to build rapport and engage people, even if we're working at an organizational or a community level. We also are all trained in assessment. We're trained in knowing the stages of change, which is how ready somebody is to actually change whatever their barrier is or whatever their need is, and to help progress, help people progress through the different stages of change and make change in their lives when needed. We're also trained at different types of brief interventions, which are ideal for a library setting. In libraries, we may see some of the same people long term, but many times we may only see somebody once or twice because they may not come back to that library, or they could be, maybe they were just there for one day, but we're often trained in brief interventions. Now, different social workers have different skills in some of these, and some may have more experience in one of these areas than others. But generally speaking, we're trained to do all of these things as part of our education. As I mentioned, social workers work at multiple levels because we do have that emphasis on helping individuals, but helping individuals in their social environment and being aware of the way the environment impacts their resources, their choices, their circumstances. So we do work at the micro or individual level, the meso or the group level, and the macro, which is the community level or that higher level. And these levels all influence one another. When we think about our own functioning, we are largely influenced by things that are happening in our immediate lives and our social, set of circumstances around us and environments. So when we look at social workers in the library, I'm going to give some examples here in a minute from specific libraries, but we generally see that social workers are offering services in libraries that are at all of those levels, the individual, the group, and then the community and organizational level. So on the micro or the individual level, we see that social workers are working with individual library visitors. They may be doing assessments. They may be assisting with information and referral about whatever that person's needs are. They may be doing crisis intervention or de-escalation when somebody's in the library and they're really escalated or upset about something. We see social workers that are offering sometimes case management, long-term or kind of short-term service navigation to help people access the services they need. And we see library social workers that are doing individual level advocacy to help somebody get their needs met. So sometimes the social worker is contacting other community organizations or even helping with things that are happening in the library environment and advocating for what that particular person may need. At the meso or the group level, we see library social workers that are facilitating programs or workshops in the library for visitors that have various kinds of needs. They may be also forming or facilitating non-clinical or mutual aid support groups, like groups that are gathering for some sort of shared medical challenge or diagnosis, or groups that are focused on substance use recovery or things like that. So sometimes the library social worker is really looking for the unmet needs in that community, and then maybe developing some sort of support group, and the library space may be provided for that support group to meet. We also see library social workers that are facilitating book groups that are books focused on particular psychosocial needs. So maybe some sort of, a book that's written right now about somebody's experience with recovery from a substance use disorder or recovery from a mental health challenge. So sometimes the library social worker is facilitating book groups around books that are related to psychosocial needs. And then we often see library social workers that are doing training for library staff on things like setting boundaries, supporting staff with handling a patron or a visitor who has escalated, or trying to de-escalate things, or identifying mental health problems and knowing what to do if somebody has a mental health crisis in the library. So in many cases, library social workers are doing at least some training with library staff to try to increase their overall capacity to respond to some of the needs that are happening in the library. And then we often see library social workers that are working at the macro level, or the organizational or the community level. So they may be doing community needs assessments to look and see where there are gaps. We see library social workers that have actually created, or they're organizing community task forces to pull together people from a variety of organizations to then tackle some of these challenges, or address some of these gaps, and try to fix those and remove those gaps. We see library social workers who are advocating for certain issues on the community level that may impact people in that local area. We also see, library social workers that are doing things that can impact the library's overall capacity to address those kinds of patron challenges or visitor challenges. Building collaborations between the library and other community organizations. So sometimes the social worker is actually going out and building relationships with other charities or nonprofit organizations that then can come in and provide some services to library visitors around certain kinds of needs. We also see library social workers that are helping to analyze policies in that library, looking for which ones may disproportionately impact specific groups of people, and making recommendations for changes that might be made. So library social workers are doing all of these kinds of things. And again, some of them may be operating at one of these levels more than others based on that particular library social work program. Our two professions really fit together very well. We have a lot of overlap in our own professional values. So when we look at shared values between social work and library work, we see an emphasis that both of us have on service and service to others. We both really prioritize privacy and confidentiality. We both prioritize wanting to make sure that people have access to accurate information. We both value people's individual rights and being respectful of those rights. Both of our professions really emphasize competence and professionalism, being honorable and having integrity. And then both of our professions emphasize the importance of social justice. One really important way that we complement one another, so we share all of those values on the previous slide. But on this one, there's an important way that we have a different perspective or value that complements each other. So public libraries have a mission to serve the whole public and everybody that makes up the public in their community. For social work, we have a professional mission to serve. Sorry, there's a mistake on this slide. We have a professional mission to, yes, serve the whole public, but we have a priority to focus on people who are marginalized or the most oppressed in any certain circumstance. So when I talked earlier about public library staff often feeling strained because patrons or visitors who have these high levels of need can often actually cause difficulty for them to address all of their other patrons' needs and what other information everybody else has or needs. For social work, our priority is the people who have the most needs or are the most marginalized or the most oppressed in any sort of circumstance. So we really complement each other that way. It's one way it's really helpful to have a social worker embedded in the library. We do see a variety of models, as I mentioned earlier. And if we look from the left to the right of this arrow, it starts with ones that are really the least level of integration between the two of our professions. And then on the right, we've got the most integrated. So we do see a lot of libraries that either have designated personnel in the library or some way of maintaining a resource list and trying to develop collaborations between the library and community partners, but there's no social worker actually in the space. Moving to the right, the next one is something that we see pretty commonly in many different communities, especially in the US right now, where many libraries are inviting community partners who may be social workers to come into the library and conduct outreach or meet with their own clients in that library space. So again, the library is not hiring a social worker, but sometimes these community partners or charities or nonprofits may have certain days of the week that they come in or certain hours. And it's a way that people in that community can access social work or other social service organizations through the library space, but the library isn't actually hiring or contracting with a social worker. Moving to the right, as I mentioned, in the US, we are seeing a pretty rapid increase in the number of libraries that are adding social work students who are interns, and many of these are libraries that do not have an on-site social worker. So these social work students are being supervised by community social workers and other people who are social workers in the community. But in these cases, the social work practicum students or interns usually complete some sort of time-limited project because they're only going to be there for 1 semester or 2 semesters, but they're actually in the library, embedded in the library, and they are on a regular basis. And then on the far right, we are seeing more and more libraries. And again, in the past year or two, these positions have increased significantly, really in multiple countries. But we're seeing an increase in libraries who are actually contracting with or hiring their own on-site social worker. So this is a map. If you're not familiar with the website and the book, Whole Person Librarianship, I encourage all of you to look into it. So the website is just wholepersonlibrarianship.com. This was one of the first books that came out, I think, in 2019, that was focused on library and social work collaborations at that time and some of the reasons why we collaborate well together. There's now this whole website. And in fact, there's a community of practice email list that you can get on through the website. And people from all across the globe who have any interest in library social work or may be library social workers or working in a library that's wanting to add social work, or sometimes it's just libraries that have questions about different things. But people in this online community of practice can send out questions and share information and resources that way. And it's really helpful. If you're not on it, since all of you here are interested in this topic, I would encourage you to get on that community of practice email list there. But there's a map at that website that tracks all known social work and library collaborations, including libraries that have full-time social workers, libraries that have a community social worker that's having office hours in that library, libraries that have part-time social work in them, and then libraries that have social work students. And again, some of those have an on-site, on-staff social worker, and many do not, with what's happening in the US at least. So you can see most of these are happening in the US or in Canada, and then there are several over here in Australia. I do know that this map tends to not be entirely accurate because it relies on libraries to self-report when they've added social work. So if you notice that your library here has a social worker and it's not on the map over in Australia, there's a place on this email or on this website to report that so that the list can be updated. But you can see where these collaborations are happening. So some specific examples, I'm going to talk about what these positions look like and also give a little information about how they started or how they were funded, so that as you're thinking about possibilities here, it might be helpful to know how others have gone about this. So some of the most well-known library social work positions in the US, as I mentioned earlier with San Francisco, are in very large urban areas. And that tends to be what people then think of, because these were the first ones. When I travel around to other size communities, sometimes they have trouble picturing how social work could work there if it's not one of these big urban areas. San Francisco, that public library system serves a population of over 800,000 people. It's led by, she's actually a marriage and family therapist by training, but her position is called a library social work position. And this was the very first one ever. And the program now she's still in it. The original social worker leads the program, but she supervises 6 outreach workers who are peers who have people who have lived experience with homelessness. And so she supervises this whole team, and they provide services to a lot of people visiting that library who are unhoused or have unsafe or unstable housing. The Denver Public Library Also in the US, in Colorado, though, serves a population of over 572,000. In that library, they have a full-time, what they call a community resource manager, who is a social worker, and 3 other full-time social workers, and a team of 6 peer navigators who are people with lived experience with homelessness. So the Denver Public Library has a large team of social workers and public library or peer navigators at this point as well. In both of these programs, their roles are to serve individual patrons as needed. They also spend a lot of time partnering with other human service organizations in the community. They create library programming for patrons who have psychosocial needs. They also engage in citywide initiatives that address homelessness and related challenges. They do a lot of educational programs and events for the community to try to increase awareness about homelessness. So they actually facilitate and host some open forums on these topics. And they provide training and resources to library staff to help increase their ability to effectively serve high needs patrons in these libraries. In all of these libraries, they also multiply the reach of a social worker by having what they call peer navigators or outreach workers, and they also use social work students who are supervised by these full-time social workers. Those, again, are atypical. Those communities are very different. The resources are different in those communities, and it's not as typical to see these big social work teams like what I just described in public libraries. So some other communities that are going about this different ways. In the San Jose Public Library, which is also in California in the US, this library serves a population of just under 1 million people. And they initially started a social work program all with volunteers. So they didn't have a full-time on-staff social worker, and instead they solicited volunteers from the community who would come in and do brief assessments. They would be in the library certain days of the week. They would do very brief assessments with people who needed connected with resources, and they would provide referrals and information to people to help connect them to various resources in the San Jose County. They also have the option, and they still have the option, of longer term service coordination or case management as needed for limited cases. So this program is not designed to be a long-term service for people, but it really is a way to just connect people with resources who may be otherwise falling through the cracks. In San Jose, they also focus on building collaborations between the library and other community organizations. They actually have hired a full-time social worker now who maintains this volunteer program, and she recruits and helps to train and supervise volunteers. We also have the Indianapolis Public Library, which is the one I mentioned earlier that we started with students, and then we're able to gather data to help justify hiring a full-time social worker. So in this library, they serve a population of about 880,000 people. And they did manage, after collecting a lot of different data, they were able to justify to their funders and their powers that be that they needed a full-time on-staff social work position. So they were able to fund that through their library's operating budget by converting a vacant librarian position to the social worker. And the social worker primarily covers one branch of the library or one location. That's the biggest one with the most needs, but she does provide some services, mostly through training, to the other 25 branches that exist in that system. She also supervises social work students, and that's a way that they've been able to magnify what one person can do in that system. In Vancouver, in British Columbia, Canada, this library serves a population of about 660,000. They actually are in the process now of hiring a really unique social work position. So they're hiring an on-staff full-time social worker who will work for their system. And really the position is designed to support staff more than working directly with the public. So this position is the health and wellness consultant, whose job it is to support the 800 plus staff members across that library system. This person will focus largely on staff wellness, and they're supposed to be responsible for developing and implementing a system-wide program for supporting staff wellness, really prioritizing staff who are working in branches that serve high needs patrons. They're also going to be providing training, counseling, and coaching to staff about workplace trauma and helping to build staff skills for managing crises. So this is a really unique library social work position because it's inward facing more than outward facing. So those are all really large communities, though. The ones I just named are really large urban areas. So I want to talk about some that may still be in urban areas, but the libraries themselves serve smaller numbers of patrons. So I talked earlier about the City of Melbourne libraries in Victoria, Australia. That library itself serves a population of about 160,000. This social work position was initially piloted through a collaboration between the council and a homelessness serving organization, and is now funded by the council. The social worker there is located in the library, and she connects people with resources for a wide variety of needs, and also supports staff through training and debriefing as needed. In California in the US, again, we have a number of positions on the West Coast in California. Burbank Public Library serves a population of about 103,000 people. They actually started their social work position in a really unique way by jointly funding it through the library's operating budget and the city's Parks and Rec department. So it's a jointly funded position between two different departments of that city. And they share a full-time position between 3 libraries and 2 senior centers that are normally supported through the city Parks and Rec department. The social worker actually rotates between the libraries and these senior centers and conducts mostly outreach to try to make people comfortable requesting services if they need connected to services or they need referred somewhere. And this person also focuses on expanding the partnerships the library has with other community organizations and charities and nonprofits. In Rochester, Minnesota in the US, this library serves a population of about 115,000. They have a social work position there that is actually an employee of a local nonprofit or charity organization. And that social worker, the agreement is that that person will work 25 hours a week in the actual library. And she maintains what they call a wellness corner. So there's an area of the library that has lots of wellness focused resources. And then she sits there for 25 hours a week to meet with people individually. She has very brief assessments, referrals, and provides whatever support people need to access services for housing, food, and other social services. And she also can do some long-term ongoing case management or service coordination as needed. This is mostly designed to just connect people with resources in the community. We have 2 libraries that are in very rural areas that have added social work. So I wanted to mention these because these are unique. And one has actually ended recently because of a funding challenge they had. So Niles Public Library, which is in Michigan in the US, serves a population of under 12,000. This was the first known rural library to add a social work position. They actually hired a full-time social services manager is what they called her. She was funded through a grant that was a 3-year grant. Her role was to supervise social work interns who provided services throughout this very rural area of the state. She also really focused on connecting people to resources and developing relationships with local service providers. And she also did a lot of training nationwide about what library social work could look like in a rural area. And unfortunately, the funding for this one ended and they were unable to find continued funding. So that's one challenge, especially in small rural areas. The second one here actually went a different route to fund the position. So in Union County Public Library in South Carolina in the US, this library serves a population of under 8,000. And they actually decided to convert their assistant director at the library position into a library social work position. So they specifically recruited for somebody with a social work degree to work as the assistant director at the library. This person then partners with the library director to perform all administrative functions that they would normally do as assistant director in the library, including supervising staff and volunteers and establishing policies and practices in the library. But she also maintains a caseload of patrons who are her clients for individual assessment, referral, and case management. they really just did not have many services in that rural community. So that's why they decided to offer these through the library, because it wasn't duplicating an existing service. There just wasn't any existing service in the community. They also maintain a food pantry in the library that's organized by the social worker, who's the assistant director, and they collaborate with other area resources to try to bring people into this county to offer services to people in that community as needed. So that's a unique one where they actually, this person still has library role, a library role, but they specifically looked for somebody with a social work degree who could offer some services there that aren't being offered elsewhere in the community. So I wanted to mention those so you would understand a variety of these positions and how they came to be and how they're structured and how they're funded, which might help you think of things that could be options here. The other thing I mentioned is social work students. So we have a lot of libraries that are adding social work interns. This is frequently now, it's becoming frequently a first step for libraries that want to have social work. They will start with a student if the university is willing to do this and if they can find a social work supervisor. And then that student, part of their role is often gathering data that then that library can use to write a grant or to justify to their city or their municipality that they need to hire a social worker. The benefits of having social work students in the library are these tend to be very inexpensive. Students can do many of the things I talked about at all of those different levels of social work practice, and they can gather data that can then help that library try to get a full-time on-staff social worker, or write a grant, or write a funding proposal. The challenges of using social work students are many, though, so you have to be careful if this is a route that you're wanting to explore. One is that there's frequent turnover. You may have a student only for one semester or for one academic year, and then you may not even have a student the next year or over any sort of gap between semesters. You also have to know that students cannot operate independently. They're going to have a social work supervisor and a library supervisor who will have to really communicate and make sure they're actively supporting that student. And then many libraries just don't have a social work program close to them or may not be able to access this on an ongoing basis. So when we look at social work in the library and all these kinds of positions, we are seeing a number of benefits. So when libraries have social work, we tend to see that there's an increased that staff report having increased support for their own wellness and well-being. It reduces some of the stress and strain on staff. We see that that library has a reduction in security interactions or calls to police, that library is able to reduce the number of visitors who wind up being barred or permanently banned from accessing that library because of disciplinary behavioral issues that have happened. We see an increase in visitors or patrons who are then linked to community resources that they otherwise weren't connected with. So it does help to prevent people from falling through the cracks in their local communities. It helps when there's a library social worker for that library then to be able to develop programming that really directly impacts some of these psychosocial needs that that visitor or patron population may have. Library social workers do help with increasing collaborations between the library and community partners, and really helping to maintain those relationships long term. And we also see that library social work positions can lead to an increase in confidence for library staff to then be able to deal with visitors who have complex needs. There are a number of barriers and challenges, though, that you need to know before you explore this option if you're thinking about it in your own library. The biggest challenge and barrier is funding and trying to figure out how these positions can be supported, especially in a time when many public libraries are seeing reductions in their own budgets. So I mentioned some of the creative ways libraries have done this in my examples. Sometimes it's through grants, but we have to be mindful of the sustainability after that grant ends. Sometimes it's through contracting with a partnering charity or social service organization to subcontract for a little bit of that person's time. Or sometimes it helps that other charity or organization meet their needs if they can actually come to the library and do outreach with certain groups of people on certain days. So that's an option. And then we also see libraries that are funding these through existing resources or being creative with the way they're using their general funding or operational budgets. Another challenge and barrier is about the liability and legal implications, and it depends largely on the area you live in, and the legal counsel that you may have in that area. I've seen some communities be very nervous about a library adding social work and the liability they're afraid that that may cause for the library. And then in other places, I've seen that not even be a challenge at all, but it's something to think about. It also has impacted how some library social workers frame the people they work with. So in some libraries, they're actually calling people their clients, and in some, they're being very specific and just call them patrons or visitors, and they're very clear that they're not doing any kind of clinical casework or clinical services. And that's usually because of liability associated with maintaining a clinical kind of caseload. Another challenge and barrier of these positions is record keeping. So most public libraries don't, they don't want confidential or private information about visitors maintained anywhere. They don't keep information like that about visitors. And so then when a social worker is there and actually needs to keep some kind of records about the people they're seeing and what they're working with those people on, that can be challenging and add some extra steps and layers that have to be sorted out in the beginning before the social worker can work with people. Another challenge is that every library is different. So I gave you a number of examples of library social work positions that actually all look very different. When I talk to these library social workers, what they're doing, there's some overlap, but the positions are different. So every library is different, and the program really has to be created from scratch to fit that library and that community. And that adds some time upfront and some challenges in the beginning, really designing what the program is going to look like and what will work in that community or not. Because of that, it's really important if your library has a social worker to allow a lot of time when that person first begins, so that they can really plan out some of these details and work through some of these logistics. We also find that social workers in libraries can be really isolated at times. We have to figure out how they're going to be supervised, how they're going to access social work supervision, and how they can support each other. I know there's a community of practice that meets regularly here that combines social workers from libraries in New Zealand and Australia to try to help build that social support for people in these roles, because otherwise they're very isolated. And we also have to really work, especially in the beginning, to manage the expectations of a particular library. Libraries are generally very excited to have a social worker on board, but especially if you have one person working in a social work role whose job is supporting patrons or visitors and supporting staff, one person can only do so much. And we have to really work to manage that library's expectations for what that one person can do and what kind of impact is realistic to expect them to have. So those are all things that can be barriers or challenges. So on the library side, if you are interested in having an on-site supervisor or on-site social worker, I'm sorry, there are several things that you can consider. One is explore what kind of partnerships you can have with local organizations in your community, and think about what charities or what organizations serve people who have some of the needs you're seeing in your own visitor population, and reach out to those organizations and start the conversation about whether there's a way for somebody from that organization to come in regularly or to somehow offer services to your visitors in your library. But that can often be a place to start. Many social service organizations or charities don't quite know the challenges that are happening in libraries. And so it takes you initiating those on the library side oftentimes, and being clear about what kinds of challenges you're facing, and really being creative and exploring how the two of you can work together to address these challenges. With these partnerships, you can allow agencies to do outreach in your library and inviting them to come in and meet with people who have various challenges, and helping work directly with people and make referrals as needed. You can also reach out to local partners or a university for assistance. So sometimes there's a partner who may not be able to come in the library and provide services on an ongoing basis, but they may be able to do training for your staff about de-escalation or boundaries or mental health crises or things like that. So don't be afraid to reach out to your local university, especially social work or some sort of human services focused discipline, or to various community partners, thinking about not only how they might be able to help your visitor population, but also if they can support your staff and help provide some sort of training for staff. As I mentioned, you can also join the whole person librarianship list to be part of that community of practice that has library staff and social workers from all across the world who are part of it, who talk about resources and share information with each other that could be helpful. I would also encourage any library that's interested in getting started to do some sort of brief needs assessment. So you don't necessarily have to have any in-depth research skills to send a questionnaire to your staff and send a questionnaire to your visitors or your patrons about their unmet needs to really figure out where you might be able to target specific services or which kinds of partnerships might be most helpful to your populations that are in your library, either working there or visiting. And then thinking about the program I mentioned earlier in San Jose, California, that got started using volunteers. You can post for and request volunteers. And they were able to start a program strictly using volunteers for years, and then were able to use information that they had gathered as part of that program to then justify the funding that they now have for their full-time social worker. But they initially started and maintained the program for many years using just volunteer social workers. Before you consider any of these, think about your goals. So what do you want to accomplish? What do you hope a social worker can do? Remember that social workers don't just work with individuals. So many times that's all we think of a library social worker doing, but library social workers can actually have more influence, especially when I was talking earlier about managing expectations and being realistic about what one person can do. If you let that one person really work at that organizational level, doing some higher level work, they can actually have more impact sometimes than if they are only meeting with individual visitors or patrons. If possible, even if you eventually want the person to be very patron focused or visitor focused, it's best to start with letting that person be more macro focused so that when that social worker starts, they're able to help determine the needs and design a program that will fit for your library. So as I mentioned, all of these positions look different and these programs look different. And we have to have time in the beginning to do some work to figure out what is going to work best in a particular library, and then really to use a design thinking approach to try something out, see how it's working, gather information about how well it's working or not, and then tweak it or change it as needed. So if possible, start with somebody who's more organizationally focused or macro focused before adding those micro focused services to just make sure that it's really being planned in a way that will work well for your library. Many times libraries just want the person to immediately start working with patrons, whether it's a student, a social work student, or a professional social worker. And instead, we have to have time to really thoughtfully plan out what that program is going to look like and work out some of those logistics I mentioned. So if you do hire somebody or have somebody in your library who's going to be primarily individual focused, again, allow time during orientation to work out some of these details. Some common misperceptions that have to be dealt with. Sometimes libraries tend to think that once there's a social worker in the library, there's going to be no more patrons who are unhoused, no more visitors who are having mental health crises, no more people who are having these kinds of challenges. And that's not the case. We have many reasons why we see the number of people with these kinds of challenges that have to do with our own communities and societies and structural barriers that exist. So a social worker can help link people to resources, but we're still going to see people in the space with these kinds of challenges. I often see libraries who think the social worker is going to be able to provide security in some way or will be there to handle really aggressive or violent patrons. Social workers aren't trained to handle violence. So just be mindful that a social worker is going to provide resources and information and support, but is not going to be operating in a security kind of role for a library. We often see another misperception that staff think they can then send every quote problem patron or every kind of challenging person to the social worker, and that they will no longer have to deal with people who can be really difficult sometimes. That's not the case. There still will be difficult people that come in the library, still will be people who have many challenges, and the social worker is part of the team that can help meet those needs. But isn't going to be able to handle every single challenge that comes in. We often see libraries too that think the social worker can fill in for other library staff as needed. Remember that everybody has a unique role. I did mention that one library that hired a social worker in a library staff position. So that person does have lots of responsibilities that are part of the library work. But in most cases, when there's a social worker, that person is not in a role that is meant to be anybody else in the library. So we've got to be mindful about what their roles are and really distinguish between people's roles and responsibilities. Another misperception that I see is that a social work student is the same as having a paid social worker in the library. That is not the same. As we talked about, you're going to get a different level of skills with a student versus a professional social worker, and you have to manage your expectations appropriately. And then again, we sometimes see that people think a single social worker in a large library is going to be able to address all of the needs that come up, and we have to manage those expectations. So on the social work side, so we were just talking about libraries that want to reach out and add social work. On the opposite side, if you're a social worker who's watching this today and you're interested in trying to collaborate with your local public library, there are a couple things that you can think about. Depending on your own roles, your skills, and your own experiences, reach out to your local library and think about areas you might be able to help with, such as actually helping with conducting a needs assessment. So helping to figure out what staff need the most or what visitor populations need the most, and then working with the library to help them think about what their next steps might be. As a social worker, you might think about where you could facilitate programming or workshops or some sort of program for patrons or visitors in that library. So think about what your skills are and what you might be able to do that could help reach people in that visitor population. As a social worker, you could offer to do staff training. So I often see across all of my needs assessments with staff that staff often want training about identifying mental health problems and what to do if they think somebody has a mental health problem. I often see staff asking for help figuring out, learning, and practicing setting boundaries with people in a way that would hopefully prevent escalation of a situation that's happening in the library. And I often see library staff that want training about self-care and how to deal with some of the trauma and stress that they're experiencing at work. And then there are a variety of other things that come up as topics too. So you could reach out to your library and ask if you could be helpful with training in any way. You could also ask about building connections between the library and community partners. So if you're somebody who has a lot of connections with various organizations in your community, you could help the library then identify what connections might be helpful. You can help look for potential funding sources for new programming and services, or help even with grant writing, depending on your skills. You may offer, depending on where you work, you may offer to hold office hours in the library on behalf of your organization. You could consider offering to supervise a social work student if there's a social work student that's ever placed in that particular library. You could volunteer to assist patrons and visitors with applying for benefits or using the computers. Many times people need help using the computers to apply for jobs, apply for public benefits, and if they don't have computer literacy skills, they can need a lot of support with that, and that causes a lot of stress for library professionals working in that library. And that's a way that social workers can often volunteer and help. And then if there's not a community resource guide in your area, that's another way that social workers can often help, is by building resource guides or resource lists that staff can then use when people have certain needs in the library. So these are all just ideas. Remember that every library is different. So reach out if you're interested in partnering, reach out to your local public library, but defer to them about what they need and what they want in light of their own patron population, their resources, and their priorities. So some libraries want more of these things than others. Some have a need for more of these than others. So defer to them. They're the experts on what's happening in their library space. So you can offer things, but ultimately defer to them about what would be helpful. So a couple of resources that you can have. I'll make sure that these slides are shared with all of you. There are some websites that are helpful. There's also an article, a journal article that is able to be accessed about social work in Australian public libraries. Then there's one from the US called The Changing Role of Libraries and How Social Work Can Help. And then an article, an online article at the bottom about libraries and social work partnerships. So those might be helpful for people interested in learning more. You also have my email address. If you have questions after this, we have a few minutes for questions, but you can also just contact me if you have a question about something I've presented today. So now I think we have just about 5 or 6 minutes for questions. I'm going to stop my screen share.
Thank you, Beth. It was a wonderful presentation. We've got a lot of interest and a lot of comments in the chat box and the question and answer. So while we understand we have limited time for question and answer, I'll just get on to the questions. There's a question. I work in an academic library, and I must say, in all the social issues I'm hearing, there are similar issues visible in academic libraries. Apart from student services, where can we seek help for our students?
Yes, so that's actually a really interesting question. I have not done any formal research or needs assessments with the academic actually, there's one going on right now I'm almost finished with, but I don't have any data to present about academic libraries. But from consultation with academic libraries in multiple places now, I am hearing over and over that these same needs are present in the people that are being served in these libraries in many cases. I actually have 2 academic libraries in the US that I'm working with who have added social work interns in those libraries from that same unit, from those universities, who are able to supplement what's offered on campus. You know, an academic library is in a unique setting because you have student serving organizations that are part of your like campus or organizations. And but sometimes students don't know about them or they don't know how to access them. So in many cases, there's a social work intern, or in these 2 cases I'm talking about, there's a social work intern that is placed in the academic library that is there to provide information and referral to other campus organizations, as well as community organizations that might also be affordable or accessible to students. In those cases, those social work students are also offering some programming. In one case, they're facilitating a stress reduction kind of group, a support group for students. But it does take some creativity to offer something that's addressing a gap on campus, but doesn't step on the toes of existing organizations that might be part of that campus that exists to serve students. So I know that was kind of a long answer, but we are seeing sometimes that social work students can be added in those academic libraries, starting with the needs assessment to really figure out what gaps are there and what needs students have, and then developing something that fits in the library context to meet those needs.
Thank you, Beth. We have 3 more minutes. I've got a question from Stacy. How do we lobby those responsible for funding in order to increase the number of social workers in libraries, especially in regional areas, which is where I live?
You ask that question again?
How do we lobby those responsible for funding in order to increase the number of social workers in the libraries?
Yes. So that's sort of how I got involved in this work in the first place, and why I get asked to do so many needs assessments. But it doesn't always take, you don't need a consultant or a researcher to necessarily do some sort of needs assessment to gather data about your population. But the only way I've ever seen the powers that be decide to fund these positions is when there's a real clear data-driven case for what the needs are. So I find that funders and municipalities and people that are responsible for determining how much money a library gets often they don't understand what's actually happening in the library. And so if you can just gather some data about the number of people who have these needs, the number of kinds of challenges that are happening, maybe attach some stories to that, talk about some of what's happening, but it usually takes a very clear data-driven case to justify to those people that social work is needed in that library. So it can take some time, but it's worth it. And also really providing, so you can access some information on some of those websites I gave out and on the whole person librarianship list. But many times it also helps make an argument to them when they see what's happening other places. So there are growing numbers of articles and things that have been written about library social work. It's not so new and it's not really a foreign concept anymore. And so sometimes combined with data about your needs in your library and your community, and these this information about the existing and rapidly growing number of positions, sometimes that will be enough to get them to at least pilot a program for a limited period and then consider adding it longer term.
Thank you, Beth. And I've got one last question that we can take in this limited time. Would you say that social workers will need to be employed part-time, or is there a need for full-time social workers?
It depends on the size of the library, and it depends on the community context and how many resources are there. In most of the communities that I've worked with, and again, these have been all sizes, so some of them have been large, but some of them have really been pretty small libraries and small communities. They have easily filled a full-time social worker's time. Now, they may have started with part-time, and again, they gather data that helps them justify an increase in funding to have a full-time person. But in many cases, it was very easy to fill a full-time social worker's days. And in fact, they need to somehow clone or multiply that person, or consider other ways like hiring less expensive peer navigators or outreach workers with lived experience, or have that person try to supervise students or find other ways to fill that time. But usually they can easily fill a full-time social worker's time.
Thank you, Beth. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. Please join me in thanking Professor Beth Wahler for a wonderful presentation. And we'll be in touch with you with answers from Professor Beth Wahler to your questions in individual emails. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this opportunity today.